Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, millions of Americans turn to the FDA for assurances that the medications and products they use are safe. Created in the early 20th century, the agency was designed to protect the U.S. consumer from unsafe, ineffective medications, equipment, and contaminated food. The agency has had some real success stories, from blocking a morning sickness drug in the 60s that caused birth defects to regulating the manufacturing of foods and purity of over-the-counter medications. The FDA has many times ensured that high-quality, trustworthy products enter American homes. But an agency that was once fully taxpayer-funded and thus worked only for the American people has now shifted to being largely funded by the very industries it regulates. 45% of the FDA's overall budget now comes from the companies it's reviewing, and 65% of the FDA's budget specifically for human drug regulation comes directly from Big Pharma itself. Now, how can an agency regulate an industry it's being funded by? That's a pretty basic and fair question. This new way to fund the FDA began in the 90s, and through the years, the FDA's reliance on company money has increased. It all started in the 80s when the HIV crisis was creating fear amongst the masses. People were upset that experimental treatments were taking a while to be approved by the FDA. Typical approval for a drug in that time was in the range of 3 to 8 years. And in response to intense pressure, Congress in the early 90s shifted how the FDA was funded in order to encourage speeding up the process. So instead of the agency being fully taxpayer funded, the new setup would have the drug companies themselves footing part of the bill. Now, this would theoretically allow the FDA to expand and hire more people to speed up the regulatory process. And in exchange for pharma money, the FDA would have to set goal dates for drug reviews that were satisfactory to the drug companies. So let's look at the safety record of the drugs since this change in funding. Now, the FDA doesn't always get it right. Prior to this shift in funding, the FDA withdrew or issued black box warning labels on about 21% of the previously approved drugs. That's not really a great record, but it gets worse after the change in funding. The FDA now withdraws or retroactively slaps warning labels on over 26% of previously approved drugs. This means that over a quarter of all FDA-approved drugs later, sometimes years later, end up either being taken off the market because they find out, oops, they're actually not so safe, or they discover serious side effects that require a large black box warning to be placed on the packaging. And a quarter is being generous. Researchers at the Yale School of Medicine found that nearly a third of approved drugs between 2001 and 2010 ended up having major safety issues years after the medications were made widely available. Now, this funding shift that lets companies pay the FDA a fee in exchange for speedy reviews isn't the only conflict of interest. The revolving door between the agency and cushy pharma jobs is another area of concern. Researchers found 27% of regulators left the FDA to work in high-paying pharma jobs. This leads us to wonder if the regulators who are looking out for their own careers are going easy on pharma in order to stay in their good graces for later job opportunities. And how they even make contacts to get those jobs is also eyebrow-raising. Questions have been raised regarding the mingling of regulators and company representatives at conferences and lunches held in high-end fancy hotels such as the Four Seasons. One such concerning annual conference is put on by the organization Impact. The stated goal of the organization is to improve the design of clinical trials. Drug manufacturers pay tens of thousands of dollars to send reps to mingle with FDA officials and NIH researchers at their annual conference. And it seems to have paid off. One clinical trial initiative that sprung from these conferences is called Enriched Enrollment, which allows drug companies to weed out subjects who are non-responsive or who have adverse reactions to the drugs from the clinical trials. This speeds up the approval process and ensures the drug will prove more effective in the data. And speaking of the data, because pharmaceutical companies are paying for the clinical trials, there are many questions regarding the impartiality of the results. Not to mention, the barometer is usually a placebo, not existing effective drugs. So a company only has to prove that their new, expensive, not eligible to be generic treatment is better than nothing. And there's the payments from the pharmaceutical companies to the FDA's physician advisors. Before drugs and treatments are approved, a panel of advisors meet to hear the science, ask questions, and vote whether or not to recommend an approval. The advisors must disclose any possible conflicts of interest. Obviously, this is meant to keep the regulators on the side of the people. But here's the problem. It's well known and widespread that panel members will receive future payments and gifts from the companies they are reviewing or from their major competitors. In fact, a study done by Science found that the 107 physician advisors they looked into, 40 of them had received post hoc earnings or research support to the tune of at least $10,000, 26 of which received more than $100,000, and 6 who received more than $1 million. The report concludes, quote, of the more than 24 million in personal payments or research support from the industry to the 16 top earning advisors who received more than $300,000 each, 93% came from the makers of drugs those advisors previously reviewed or from competitors, unquote. So yeah, maybe these advisors didn't have conflicts of interest before their vote, but knowing the drug companies might make it rain after their vote sure can be persuasive. So in recap, we have a regulatory body that's funded by the very companies they are supposed to be regulating, with about a third of the regulators and advisors either moving on to cushy big pharma careers or receiving lucrative payouts after approving the drugs or halting the drugs of competitors based on data from expensive clinical trials funded by the pharmaceutical companies that test their treatments against literally nothing. So it's no wonder that a third of all approved treatments are later found to have harmful, unknown side effects. This is once again a government body, like Congress, that is supposed to be beneficial to the American people that has instead been corrupted by big money. And the solution towards taking steps to correcting it begins with eliminating those avenues that allow these multi-billionaires the ability to have so much influence. So Ryan, I'm going to ask you, getting money out of politics is obviously something that many of us continue to talk about. Do you see a way for us to kind of start getting that process done? It's not just Congress, it's also these regulatory bodies.
Yes, we have to overthrow the entire ideology of neoliberalism, which says that things that ought to be public should instead be given over to the private sector, which can handle them better, allowing you to shrink the size of the government. That what you described, is a function of this 40-year war on the state apparatus, on the ability of government to do things. And so as we kind of reorient ourselves around the idea that government actually is capable of doing things, then we have to start, reinvigorating it, giving it a sense of integrity, paying bureaucrats better so that these FDA jobs become something that people want to make a career out of, and that it's stigmatized and frankly illegal, to trade on your government service to go get rich in the pharmaceutical industry. And there needs to be, think about the stigma that a detective in the 1950s who's investigating the mob would have faced if they then went and started working for the mob.
Right.
Nobody would do that, and you have to bring that culture to government. It should not be okay to continue going through this revolving door.
So a bit of a counterpoint, though I found myself agreeing with much of what Kim said. My fear is this, having worked in the federal government during the COVID pandemic, dealing directly with the FDA and the CDC, I can tell you I've never worked, and I worked at the Department of Defense, I've never worked with a government bureaucracy more inefficient and more unaware that there was a fire under them and they still couldn't get things done than the FDA during COVID. And granted, that is kind of the Super Bowl in the worst way of what the FDA is ever going to deal with. Of course, we need credible, independent regulatory bodies to look at our medicines and our treatments. But one story I remember being told by Dr. Redfield, the former director of the CDC, who at the time, would have been decades ago during the AIDS and HIV crisis, was a military doctor. And there were therapeutics that had not gone through full approval by the FDA, authorized under emergency use, that he could not get approval within the FDA for nearly 20 years. And he told me that he could point to the number of lives that could have been saved of people who fell victim to AIDS had that been approved sooner. So there is a conflict here of the bureaucracy of government and cutting through that. And then there's the side of the private sector where, listen, they have the market incentive and the money incentive to get things done and to get things done quickly. I think there's an in-between here, because I would never trust what I saw at the FDA to solely be responsible for doing this, independent of outside influence. And just one more point, we like to demonize big pharma. There's plenty to criticize, but I would say this: it was big pharma that helped us get to a place where we have 3 safe vaccines on market in record time for a novel pathogen that we were totally unprepared for and unable to. I don't think the FDA could have done that in 10 to 20 years if we had left it solely to them. So the research and development advantages there, I think, outweigh some of these conflicts, though I think they're very valid points to raise.
Yeah, there's probably some sort of a system that, clearly what was going on before had its problems, like you were mentioning with the slowdown in drug approvals. But obviously what we have now is also a lot of big pharma influence in our government and reaching all levels of our government in all branches of government, essentially. So we do have a real problem. And there's other countries that are doing it in different ways. The UK obviously does it a bit differently than we do here. So there's probably more than one way to get this done. But I think there definitely needs to be a change.
Right.
All right.
And just one last point. Big Pharma, yes, deserves partial credit, of course, for creating these vaccines in such a rapid amount of time. Was kind of a collective miracle, but they also did it with massive public funding and on the back of a lot of university research, much of which is publicly funded. So we shouldn't forget that as well.
All right, Alyssa, looking forward to your radar next.